And we are back for a UFC Fight Night, Kattar versus Chikadze. Hope you guys enjoyed the holidays. The time off was great. Had a little bit of a reset, but now we're back at it. It's a new year, new slate, but same old shit because we got to do the recaps first. So it's been a couple weeks since the Daukaus Lewis event, so I'll try my best to recall what happened there. But let's get right down to business here. So overall, I think I did pretty well this event. But kicking off the card, Jordan Levitt, Matt Sales, and I did bet Levitt here. I thought he'd have a pretty big edge in the grappling. Sales would probably have the striking advantage, but, long time off, coupled with the fact, he ballooned up during the off season, and, he's moving up a weight class. I just thought that Levitt would have a lot of success in the grappling, and he did. Sales definitely showed some poor fight IQ, but, the guy didn't look in great shape going into this fight, and that was one of the reasons I did look to fade him this fight. 2 years off and looking kind of bloated going into this fight. And the performance kind of showed it. Pretty easy cash there. Moving along. Don'Tale Mayes, Josh Parisian. I ended up putting Mayes in a parlay. Parlayed a lot this card because there were some pretty big favorites that I thought should win. Didn't go too hard on it because I didn't think the favorites were, super reliable, but at the same time, I just didn't think their opponents were that great. And, this was a typical case here. Parisian, very, very low level. And for as much as, we want to hate on Mayes, I don't think he's a bad fighter. I think he's a much better fighter than Parisian. Historically, the only time Mayes really struggled is when, he's on his back. But, Parisian's not going to do that. And Mayes just showed that he was just a level above Parisian in regards to the grappling and the striking. So pretty easy cash here. Parisian, honestly, he just kind of sucks. There's not really anything he's quite good at, aside just moving forward, throwing a bit of volume, but didn't really matter here. Mayes just took him down, pretty much just dominated him, and Mayes isn't even a grappler. So we move along. Raquel Pennington, Macy Chiasson. I had Pennington parlayed as well. She was pretty juiced favorite, but, I did really like her in this matchup. Really don't think too highly of Chase on here, but we do know that Pennington's a very well-rounded fighter and that there was going to be, I think, a clear path to victory here in the grappling, in the clinch. And she was able to, eventually find the finish on Chase on and kind of dodged a bit of a bullet here. Almost wanted to take Pennington by decision, but just thought better of it. Honestly, if the decision line was a little better, I probably would have played it, but ended up just going for the money line in a parlay instead. But moving along, Charles Jourdain. Andre Ewell did not have any action on this fight. Jourdain was a pretty juiced favorite going into this fight. I did expect him to win, but, he's been pretty unreliable. So I didn't really want to lay the juice on him. Andre Ewell, on the other hand, it looks like, his career is starting to take a bit of a decline here. I'm not sure if moving up a division was the move for him. Now he's going to be a bit outsized. On top of the fact that his cardio kind of sucks. So, he's getting a bit older. He's taking a lot of damage now. I just don't know how much more of a future he's got at the UFC level. But moving along, Melissa Gatto, Sijara Eubanks. Ended up taking a small shot on Gatto because while I did say before that I felt Eubanks is a little more proven and probably the more skilled fighter, I feel she's only got maybe one good round of grappling cardio in her. And it definitely showed this fight. She had a good first round, but, Gatto did a good job of making her work, making her really, use her energy to remain on top. Gatto is someone who will play off her back, but, she's very aggressive there. She's not just going to lay there and try and throw elbows. And she really made Eubanks work, basically. And once Gatto was able to get up from that and Sijara wasn't able to hit any more takedowns, I felt it was pretty much downhill from there. Even if Gatto hadn't landed that kick to the body, it was probably going to be Gatto rounds 2 and 3. Kind of glad I cashed there. Didn't go too hard because at the end of the day, Gatto was pretty unproven. So we move along. Justin Taffa, Harry Hunsucker ended up parlaying the under in this fight and then took Hunsucker to win in round 1. In hindsight, obviously, Taffa round 1 was probably the play, but the main read here was that, Hunsucker's kill or be killed. If he doesn't get the knockout early, he's just going to crumble in there. Ended up taking the small shot on Hunsucker round 1 just because, the plus 800 was really juicy, but the main play was the under 2.5. Probably could have gone under 1.5, but I just felt like playing it super safe this fight. I had that parlayed with something else on the card here. I'll go over that in just a second. But yeah, not much to say here. Harry Hunsucker, really not UFC caliber. The guy's chin is super suspect, and if he doesn't get you out of there in that first minute and a half, he's probably done. So, moving on to the next fight, Gerald Meerschaert, Dustin Stoltzfus had Meerschaert parlayed with Ricky Simon, which I'll talk about later. But this fight was definitely a bit hairy, especially in those first 2 rounds. Meerschaert, he had some very ill-advised guillotine attempts early, basically gave up position. Definitely dropped the second round. That first round was very dicey as well. It could very well have been 1-1 going into the third round. Could have been 2-0 Dustin Stoltzfus, but, Meerschaert definitely pulled a veteran move here, pulling off that late submission. You could say the value is probably on Stoltzfus, but Meerschaert, he has shown he's capable of pulling off these late submissions. And overall, I did feel that Meerschaert was the better grappler. He just had some bad guillotine attempts that led to him playing off his back a little longer than he should have. But, I think he knew round 3 that he was up against it. It was possibly 1-1, potentially 0-2, and that he likely needed to finish, and he got it. But Meerschaert, definitely one of these guys you don't really want to be laying the chalk on. But, kind of lucked out there a little bit. But at the same time, the guy is the superior grappler. So, probably not the best bet, but, he still ended up cashing. So moving along, Cub Swanson, Darren Elkins. Didn't have any action on this fight. For me, it was Elkins or pass, but Swanson just completely blew him out of the water early. Elkins just a little too slow at this stage in his career, even against an older Cub Swanson. And Elkins, he did show phenomenal heart in that fight. Wasn't out cold, but, the guy was taking way too much damage. But, yeah, overall, Elkins just way too hittable, way too slow at this stage in his career. He's going to have some very favorable matchups if I ever want to bet him again. But from the looks of it, I doubt it. I mean, looking back, Minner and Garagori aren't even that good of wins. So let's move it along here. Mateus Gamrot, Diego Ferreira. Ended up passing on this fight too. I thought that Ferreira stylistically would have been a tough matchup for Gamrot, but it does look like the age and maybe the wear and tear is starting to build up on Ferreira here. I actually remember him getting hurt pretty bad to the body against Dariush, and then it happened here again. So the guy might be a little weak to the body, but supposedly he had an injury going into this fight as well. But Gamrot looking like he's on the up and up. Ferreira looking like bit of a decline. And talk about declines, we got to move on to the next fight. Simone Assunção. Assunção, I think, is definitely on his way out here. Getting knocked out by Simone. I did parlay Simone up, just played his money line. I thought there'd be a lot more wrestling going on in this fight, but Simone looked pretty comfortable on the feet, and he was winning most of the striking exchanges. And he did eventually find the knockout, but it does look like the age and the wear and tear is catching up to Assunção here. Part of the reason I played the money line over just Simone by decision. Partially that, and also, if Simone's having a ton of success with the grappling, he could potentially get a TKO finish or something if Assunção started to slow down later in the fight. But the chin of Assunção is probably gone at this point. But moving along, Amanda Lemos, Angela Hill. Had Lemos parlayed up. I believe I had her parlayed with Pennington. Only put like about a unit or a unit and a half or something. Didn't want to go too big because while I did feel, Lemos and Pennington should win, the lines were a little wide, and, they were facing like decent opponents. A lot of people are going to say that, they had Angela Hill winning this. Personally, I had Lemos winning the third round by a very thin margin. Regardless, Hill definitely was the side, especially Hill by decision. Ton of value there, but honestly, just got a little lucky. I cashed on that. So let's move along. Bilal Muhammad, Stephen Thompson. So I ended up betting Bilal moneyline, Bilal by decision, and then fight goes the distance. So obviously I like Bilal because I felt there was a very clear path with the wrestling, and there was. I just also took the goes the distance prop in Bilal by decision just because Bilal doesn't really finish anyone, even though he came real close to this fight. Could have been a stoppage. Kind of looked out, it wasn't, but at the end of the day, Bilal's just not really someone with a ton of finishing instinct. But yeah, Burns kind of did lay the blueprint for how to beat Thompson, going forward. And I felt that Bilal had all the tools to replicate that sort of game plan again against Thompson. And overall, wasn't really surprised with the outcome here. Was a little surprised with the amount of people that were on Thompson pre-fight, though, especially after his performance against Burns. But moving along, Derek Lewis, Chris Daukaus ended up passing on this fight. Just didn't think I had the best read on this fight. And, when I want to bet Lewis, I usually want a slightly bigger number next to his name. And I was a little worried about the speed of Daukaus, but it looks like the size and the physicality of Lewis was just a bit too much for Daukaus. Once he had him backed up against the cage and just started unloading on him, it was just a little too overwhelming for Daukaus. Daukaus never was really able to get much going. Wasn't able to get the respect of Lewis early, and Lewis was able to just start bombing on him. But overall, it really was a massive size advantage for Lewis. Lewis is a legit heavyweight, and Daukaus is definitely on the smaller end of heavyweights. Arguably, could be a light heavyweight. And the speed advantage of Daukaus probably not going to matter as much if you're just going to get bombed on against the cage. So yeah, that does it for the recap. Let's move into the breakdowns for UFC Fight Night. Kattar versus Chikadze. And in the next fight, we have Jamie Pickett versus Joseph Holmes. And Holmes is the minus 159 favorite. Come back on Pickett is plus 139. And I think this is a pretty straightforward fight, pretty simple fight to break down here. We'll start with Jamie Pickett. And really the only thing you need to know about this guy is he's super low volume. Pickett just does not want to throw in there. Super low work rate. He can wrestle a bit. He's got decent striking, but 80% of the time he's just going to be backing up and letting his opponent dictate the fight. He's 1-2 in the UFC, with his one win being over Staropoli, who is a bloated up welterweight. And I did bet on Pickett that fight, but that was still a very close fight. So while I don't think Pickett's an awful fighter or anything, he's just super unreliable. You just can't really trust him to really do anything. And he'll be going up against Joseph Holmes, who he's going to be making his UFC debut on somewhat short notice. Holmes does look like he's mainly a striker. He does seem to have some power, does stay pretty active in there. And I don't think Holmes is going to be coming in, out of shape or anything. The guy's fought like 6 times in 2021, 3 times in like the last 3 or 4 months. So I do think he's going to be in pretty good shape coming into this fight. But yeah, taking a look at this matchup, I definitely have to side with Holmes here, just based off of the fact that, Pickett doesn't throw at all. And, we're probably going to see Holmes just tee off on Pickett, especially as the fight starts to progress. However, there are a few concerns on the Holmes side. One, it is a short notice fight. I'm sure he'll be in shape, but, regardless, it is, he is taking this fight on short notice. And second, Holmes, he is someone who's got a lot of early finishes. He's got finishes in the second round as well, but, by and large, the guy's running through most of his opponents, and, just sifting through the records of some of these guys, they're all pretty low level. There's, 6-5 guy, 3-2, 0-1, 4-1, 6-8. So, he's not particularly tested. But that said, though, Pickett's not really that good either. And, while Pickett does have some UFC experience and a little more regional experience as well, he's still out there getting his ass beat. So the pick is Holmes, but I probably won't bet this fight either. And moving along, we have Raoni Barcelos versus Victor Henry. And no odds for this fight just yet. Was announced a couple days ago, but they still haven't released the odds yet. But Henry is going to be coming in short notice against Barcelos. So we'll start with him first. Henry, from what I've seen, doesn't look like too bad of a fighter. He seems to be pretty decently well-rounded in terms of his striking and his grappling. He's got decent volume, decent output. His cardio seems fine. However, the big takeaway, I think, from watching some of his tape is that it does look like he struggles a bit with the defensive grappling. His takedown defense doesn't look particularly good, and it does look like he can get stuck on his back a bit. Granted, these fights were from a little while ago. Wasn't able to find too many of his recent fights, but at least in the past, it does look like he's someone who has been, stuck on his back before. So a little concerning here because he'll be going up against Barcelos, who, is a very well-rounded fighter. He's got really good grappling, good jiu-jitsu, and then his boxing is on point as well. And Barcelos has kind of made a career of beating these UFC newcomers or prospects, even though Henry, I wouldn't consider Henry a prospect, but Barcelos has made a career out of beating these mid-lower level guys. And I don't think Henry's any different. In fact, I think this might be one of Barcelos' easier matchups compared to some of his other opponents that he's faced, like Nurmagomedov, even Taha and Valiev. So a decent step down in competition for Barcelos here, and a pretty sizable step up in competition for Henry. So overall, I really like Barcelos in the spot. If I had to line the fight, it'd probably be at about like minus 300 for Barcelos, because I just don't see a way Henry can really beat Barcelos here. Barcelos is probably going to have to slow down considerably for Henry to have a chance. Or, Henry could clip Barcelos with something. But, Barcelos still looks like a really solid fighter right now. He's getting a bit older, but, he still put on a solid performance against Valiev. Dropped him a couple of times. And Henry, not exactly a young prospect himself. I think they're actually the same age. So age probably not a big factor. The wear and tear probably in favor of Barcelos as well, because, Barcelos hasn't really taken as much damage, and he actually has fewer professional fights than Victor Henry. But I guess the big concern with Barcelos is that, he can be a bit passive. He's got decent power on the feet and pretty technical boxing, but he could just be a bit low volume at times, and I think that is what lost him his last fight against Valiev. He had Valiev hurt a couple of times in there, but in the other rounds that he didn't, he just wasn't keeping up with the output of Valiev, and that kind of led to him dropping 2 of the 3 rounds. So that is a bit of a concern for Barcelos, but I do feel he's got a pretty comfortable path to victory here in the grappling against Henry, assuming Henry hasn't made like crazy improvements to his game. But at this stage in his career, I just don't know if he's going to be shoring that up. So I do think that on the feet, Barcelos should be winning the boxing exchanges. Henry might be able to outwork and outvolume Barcelos over the course of 15 minutes, but Barcelos could just be landing the heavier, cleaner shots. And of course, Barcelos does have the grappling path if he does decide to take it. So I really like Barcelos here. Might put him in some parlays if the price is reasonable, but I just don't know where the bookies are going to open this line. I wouldn't take Barcelos as too juiced of a favorite, because even though he should win, I just don't know enough about Henry to say that Barcelos should be a lock here or anything. But I do think this is a pretty favorable matchup for Barcelos, and he really should win this. So I'm going to go with Barcelos. I think he could get it done via decision, possibly submission if Henry hasn't really shored up his defensive grappling. In the next fight, we have TJ Brown versus Gabriel Benítez, and Benítez is the minus 180 favorite. Comeback on Brown is plus 155. And we'll take a look at Brown first, who does have a wrestling base. The guy's when he does get his wrestling going, can have a lot of success. But he can box as well. His boxing, I don't think, is particularly great. He's decent offensively, but, defensively, he does leave a lot of holes. He is kind of hittable, and it does look like he gets dropped like every other fight. So the chin is a little weak, but offensively, it does seem decent. But, of course, he does have the wrestling to fall back to if he needs to. And he'll be up against Benítez, who I think is a solid vet, definitely a bit of a gatekeeper at this point. And I suspect that Benítez is declining a little bit, but he is primarily a striker. His takedown defense and defensive grappling is a little suspect, I think. I know his numbers are a little skewed, because there are a few fights where he just got repeatedly taken down. And that definitely is a concern here, because TJ Brown, when he does decide to wrestle, he can do it pretty effectively. And when he gets it going, he can hit like 4 or 5 takedowns in a fight. So I do feel there's a path to victory here for Brown. But on the feet, I do think Benítez should take it. I think he's the much more technical striker, much more experienced there. But, I do want to say I do think that Benítez is slowing down a little bit. He's declining a bit. He's getting caught in a lot of his fights. Like, he's taken a lot of damage in his most recent fight. And then even in the Janes fight, Janes was landing that overhand on him. And even before that, we see Benítez, getting caught quite a bit by Yusuf. Morales was landing a bit on Benítez as well. Obviously, TJ Brown not really at these guys' level, but still got to be a little concerned if you're on the Benítez side. Regardless, though, I am still taking Benítez to win. He's the better striker in there, and honestly, I think the experience is a huge factor as well. The concerns on Benítez's side is he's really only beaten guys who aren't really UFC caliber. His most recent wins, James, Bandonai, and even Jason Knight are guys who are no longer with the promotion. An argument can be made that, if he gets the win over TJ Brown here, Brown will probably get cut as well. So it'll just be another win on Benítez's record, another guy that's, not really UFC caliber. And, if I'm being honest, I feel that Brown is a bit of a fraud as well. I mean, if you just look at the competition he's going up against at the UFC level, Jordan Griffin, Danny Chavez, Kai Kamaka, all guys who, well, two of these guys aren't even with the promotion anymore. Chavez is probably going to get cut pretty soon here. So Brown's basically fighting, bottom of the barrel guys in the division. Lost to two of them. Arguably could have lost the Kai Kamaka fight as well. So he's 1-2, potentially could have been 0-3 against, just lower level guys in the division. And if you go even further back, towards when he's, fighting on the regionals, he's not even fighting like the best guys either. I mean, about 20 fights into his career, he's still fighting guys who are 8-18, 4-5. So, I just really don't think that TJ Brown is really all that good. And at 15-8, most of his work being done on the regionals, I think his record is super salty as well. So I think this is Gabriel Benítez's fight to lose. Don't know if I want to bet him though, because I do feel Benítez is on a bit of a decline. And on top of that, there is a path to victory for Brown in the wrestling, but I just don't think he's quite at that level. I think that on the feet, Benítez should piece up Brown. I think the leg kicks are going to be super damaging for Benítez. We saw Brown struggle quite a bit with the kicks of Danny Chavez, and Benítez has got some very nasty leg kicks. And, if he can kick out the legs of Brown, then we're going to see Brown start to struggle a bit, on the feet. He's not going to be as mobile. It's going to be harder for him to shoot. It's going to be hard for him to strike effectively. So I do think this is Benítez all day. I think Benítez could potentially even hurt Brown. We've seen Brown drop multiple times. He's shown decent recoverability, but, he's been rocked, he's been dropped, he's been finished as well. So Benítez takes us on the feet. The only thing really keeping me off of, just dropping the hammer on Benítez here is the wrestling of Brown. That is going to be a very clear path to victory for him. And then secondly, just the fact that Benítez is declining, essentially. I mean, he's been clipped clean in at least like 3 or 4 of his last fights. So a little wary about dropping the hammer on Benítez here, but I do think he should get it done. So official pick is going to be Benítez. I'll take him to get it done by round 1 knockout. And moving along, we have Vanessa Demopoulos versus Silvana Gómez Juárez. And Juárez is the -120 favorite. Demopoulos is the +100 underdog. So we'll start with the slight underdog in Demopoulos first. She is primarily a grappler. I believe her base is in jiu-jitsu. Her striking isn't particularly great. She's a little plotty and a little hittable on the feet. That said, though, she is very tough. She's got a lot of heart. She will continue to move forward and throw regardless. However, for someone who I would consider a grappler, she doesn't seem to really have the most urgency in getting the fight to the ground. She does seem pretty content to just stand and strike with a lot of her opponents. And something that I also didn't really like was that she does look like she is someone who will play off her back a bit if you can take her down. So, not very encouraging there. But she's going up against Juárez, who, I don't really rate highly either. Gómez Juárez is a striker, and she does look like she's got a bit of power, but based off of the very limited footage I've seen, it doesn't look like she's fighting really any good opponents whatsoever. And honestly, her striking looks kind of basic as well. Like, I just think she's got a super padded record. I mean, if you're just watching some of the fights she's been in, they're honestly kind of sad. Some of her opponents don't even look like they belong in there with her. And the fact that she's got this many knockouts on her record, I think is actually a bit of a red flag, because either she's got just phenomenal power or she's just out there beating a bunch of bums. And I'm leaning towards the latter. So this is a very easy Vanessa Demopoulos pick for me. I think on the feet, it's probably going to be pretty competitive. Demopoulos' striking really isn't all that good, and she is super hittable. So, I think it's pretty 50-50 on the feet. I do think Demopoulos has got a bit of upside if she decides to look to grapple a little bit. But overall, I'm going to side with Demopoulos here. And, just going to do a little bit of MMA math here. Both of these fighters have fought Lupita Godinez. Godinez was pretty much able to just run through Gómez, took her down early, and then was able to find the armbar late in the first round. Whereas Demopoulos went 5 rounds with Godinez in what was a pretty back and forth fight. She did fight somewhat competitively there. It was a little while ago, but all things considered, she gave a much better account of herself than Gómez Juárez. So yeah, the pick for me is Demopoulos here. Might even better as well. But probably wouldn't go too heavy on her just because, Demopoulos, she's actually kind of small for the division. And on top of that, she isn't the most reliable to go to her grappling, which is going to be the biggest path to victory for her. Because if this is a stand-up affair, this could be very 50-50, and we could actually see Gómez Juárez, pull off a victory here if it just is 100% a stand-up affair. But ultimately, this is a little bit of a fade on Gómez Juárez as well. She's 37 years old, making her second fight in the UFC. Hasn't really beaten anyone but bums. So I think the upside is going to be with Demopoulos. So I'm going to pick Demopoulos. I think she can get the submission, but I also think she could win a decision victory as well. Moving along, we have Dakota Bush versus Viacheslav Borshchev, and Borshchev's the minus 177 favorite. Come back on Bush is plus 152. So we'll start with Bush, who does seem like a somewhat well-rounded fighter. Not really sure what his base is in, probably in grappling, because on the feet he does look a little wild. Does seem to have a bit of power as well, but overall does look a little unpolished in the stand-up. He does have a decent kicking game as well, but I have seen him look to get fights to the ground, and there he does look somewhat proficient. He looks to advance positions, looks to find submissions. Overall, doesn't look like too bad of a fighter, but he hasn't really fought the highest level competition out there, and there are some concerns with him as well. His cardio does seem like it's a little suspect. He doesn't seem to have really good defensive grappling either. And this is more so based off of the Hubbard fight, which, I don't know if you want to take too much stock in, because Bush was coming in short notice in that fight. I think like 2 or 3 days notice. And he did look pretty tired, I'd say, after that first round. So I do have to assume that, now that he's gotten a full camp for this fight, we should expect to see him have a better cardio going into this fight. But he'll be going up against Borshchev, who is making his UFC debut as well. Does seem like a pretty solid prospect as well. He's got good boxing, good power, very aggressive on the feet. Likes to just pressure opponents, back them up, and just unload on him. The guys look really solid so far. He's running through a lot of his regional opponents. Has shown that he can go 3 rounds. I suppose he's done it twice. Lost one of them. Overall, though, it is still somewhat improving. The guy's 5-1, and all of his fights have been on the regional scene. One fight in the Contender Series, which more or less a regional fight, honestly. But look, the guy looks good, but it's hard to tell how good he really is. And like I've been saying throughout this podcast, it's just really hard to want to lay chalk on these prospects who are making their UFC debut, guys who haven't really been tested, and guys who have more or less just been running through lower level guys at the regionals. So, just based off of what I see, I think I like Borshchev a little better. He's been a lot more dominant in his wins, and he does look like he's got some power. He does look like, he's quite technical in there. So I'm going to pick Borshchev to win, but I don't really advise laying the chalk on Borshchev, considering, he's still somewhat green in his career. He only started professionally fighting like 2 years ago. Fought some pretty low-level guys, but it does look like he's got a bit of potential here. So, if the guy's the real deal, we'll have plenty of opportunities to look to bet him or even fade him going forward. So, official pick is Borshchev, and I think he gets it done via decision. Bush hasn't shown a terrible chin or anything, and I do think that if Bush looks to, implement some of his grappling, he could kind of drag the fight a little longer than it should be, look to wear Borshchev out a little bit. But overall, I do think that Borshchev should be able to keep it standing, do enough on the feet, do enough damage on the feet to win a decision here. And moving along, we have Chase Sherman versus Jake Collier. This is a pick'em fight, minus 110 both ways. And this is your typical low-level heavyweight fight here. We'll start with Jake Collier. The guy moves pretty well for a heavyweight. He's got decent volume, decent output. Cardio's all right. He very much still fights like a middleweight in there. Just lots of movement, lots of side-to-side movement. And, he could push a decent pace, and he's got decent output as well. The guy was middleweight before. Fought a ton of fights at middleweight, some at light heavyweight, but primarily middleweight, before ballooning up, moving up to heavyweight after a 3-year long layoff. Gets starts by Aspinall early. Not sure if you could take too much from that. The guy was coming off of a pretty long layoff, and he was going up against a solid prospect in Aspinall. But since then, he's been in a couple close fights, getting a win over John Vellante and fighting really closely with Carlos Felipe. But overall, Collier's offensive striking is decent. The only thing really about him is he is pretty hittable. He's taking a decent amount of damage, even against guys like Vellante and Felipe. Both, actually pretty close fights. I thought the Volante fight was a bit of a blowout, and I thought that he might have, won the Felipe fight. But, after rewatching them, it does look like, he was taking a ton of damage those fights. And for that reason, even though he's got good output and volume, he is susceptible to taking a bit of damage himself. And he'll be going up against Chase Sherman, who, not doing too hot in the UFC either. Since his return to the UFC, he's only beaten Ike Villanueva, but has losses to guys like Arlovsky, Parker Porter, Sakai, Willis, and Abdurakhimov. So, he's losing to some decent UFC fighters, but his one win is over Ike Villanueva, who is a bloated up light heavyweight. Honestly, a guy could be a middleweight as well. But, similar to Collier, who only has a win over Jean Volante at the heavyweight division, Volante is also a bloated up middleweight as well. So overall, I do feel both guys are at around the same level. Sherman, though, I would classify as a bit more of a natural heavyweight. I think the guy is a little more dangerous in the first round than Collier. I think he's, packs a lot more power in his punches. It does look like, Sherman's kind of struggled a bit when he gets extended. I think his cardio's a little suspect. He was barely keeping up with a 40-year-old Arlovsky, and Porter was able to just tie him up in the clinch, hold him up against the cage, and kind of just grind him out to a decision. But overall, I do think that Sherman's a decent offensive striker. He's just kind of had the misfortune of fighting, some decent fighters in Arlovsky and Sakai back in the day, even someone like Abdurakhimov. But overall, I think this is a much better matchup for Sherman. Before I did the tape, I was actually leaning the Collier side. I thought he'd just be able to volume up Sherman in this fight. But, after doing the tape, I'm not as confident. I actually think this is going to be a pretty close fight, because even though Collier's got decent volume, he is super hittable. And, he's just primarily a striker. He doesn't really fight in the clinch. He doesn't really wrestle at all. So I do think that it's going to be pretty back and forth. And for that reason, I think I'm actually going to be more so on the Sherman side. I just think that Sherman, being the more natural heavyweight, he's probably going to hit a little harder. I think he's probably going to be landing the more impactful shots. And then on top of that, I do think that Sherman's got a little more knockout upside. So earlier I did say not to look too much into the Collier-Aspinall fight, because, Aspinall's a solid prospect, and Collier was making his heavyweight debut, after a 3-year-long layoff. But if there is any sort of takeaway from that fight, it's that, Collier's chin at heavyweight might be a little suspect. I know we're dealing with a one-fight sample size, but it's the only fight at heavyweight that, he's been knocked out in. And then the 2 fights after that, he's really just fought a bunch of blown-up middleweights. So really, we haven't seen Collier fight another, I guess, natural heavyweight outside of Aspinall. And, the one thing we do know about Sherman is he does seem to have a bit of power, at least on the regionals. He's running through these guys, getting a lot of early knockouts. Hasn't really shown as much, at the UFC level when he's fighting, better competition. But I'm not sure Collier's exactly, high-level heavyweight here. And he has been knocked out at heavyweight. So, I'm not saying that Sherman's going to come in here and just knock Collier out, but I do think it's on the table, especially early. So I'm going to go with Sherman for this fight. I just think that, he could potentially knock Collier out early, but over the course of 3 rounds, I just see this being a very back and forth fight, probably pretty even on the feet, but I just see Sherman maybe landing the slightly harder shots, the more damaging shots. So I think that if it does go to a decision, we could see Sherman win a pretty close one, and I do think that Sherman could potentially get the knockout early as well. So the pick for me actually is going to be Sherman. I might even actually place a bet, but I'm going to wait on the line a little bit. I'd like to get a plus number next to Sherman. It looks like some of the lines are trending this way. If I can get at least plus 100, maybe like plus 110 or so. Might put a unit on him. Might put a little bit on Sherman by knockout as well, because I do think there is a possibility that, the size could be a bit of an issue for Collier in this fight. And real quick, I think people might try and draw comparisons to, the Parker Porter Chase Sherman fight, but I just don't think that Collier is really the type of fighter that Porter is. Porter, he actually uses his size pretty well. He's kind of bloated up as well, but, Porter is actually someone, he really sits down on those kicks. He's really good at using his weight, making his opponents bear his weight, whereas Collier, he's more of just, throw volume sort of fighter. So I think that if that's the case, Sherman's going to have a lot of success on the feet. So I'm going to go with Sherman, official pick. I'm going to take him to win by decision. Moving along, we have Ramiz Brahimaj versus Court McGee, and McGee's the minus 120 favorite. Come back on Brahimaj is plus 100. And we'll start with Ramiz here. So Ramiz, he's a very high-level submission grappler. He's very strong, very fluid on the ground. He's super dangerous there, but it does look like he might be a sub or bust sort of fighter. Pretty much all of his wins are via submission pretty early in the fight, anytime he's been extended, or if he isn't able to get the fight to the ground, he will struggle a bit. And on top of that, I do think his fight IQ is a little suspect. I know it's just one fight, but in his fight against Max Griffin, he was getting thoroughly boxed up on the feet, literally had his ear boxed off, but didn't attempt any takedowns or even try to get the fight to the ground where he had his best shot of winning. It was good to see him go back to his grappling in his most recent fight against Palatnikov. And he did win this fight, or that fight, very dominantly, but Palatnikov's a very green fighter, not a UFC caliber fighter. And he's got terrible defensive grappling as well. But he'll be going up against Court McGee, who is a bona fide vet, very crafty in there, can do a little bit of everything. However, with McGee, I do believe he does his best work when he's able to mix in the wrestling and the grappling. But, lately he's primarily just been a striker, which, is going to be a little bit of an issue because, he is getting a little older. He's getting a little slower. And on top of that, I do think the durability is starting to take a bit of a hit. The guy's been dropped in 3 of his last 4 fights. So, you do have to be a little concerned here. That said, though, Ramiz, not exactly a high-level striker. In fact, I think Ramiz's striking is a step down from some of the guys that McGee's been fighting lately. And one thing to note with McGee is he's never been submitted. So if you're on the McGee side, that is a bit comforting to know. So, taking a look at this matchup, it's a little tough to call because, we're dealing with an aging fighter in McGee who honestly hasn't looked particularly great. His last 2 wins are over Claudio Silva, who's like 40 years old, and Alex Garcia back in 2018. Both fights that McGee won, when he went to the wrestling and was able to have a bit of wrestling success in those fights. And as far as the striking goes, I think I do still favor McGee here. I think that he's the much more experienced striker. He does seem a lot more comfortable there. Ramiz, I do think, is a step behind. We kind of saw it in the Max Griffin fight. He wasn't really never able to get any sort of, striking offense going. Ramiz will also be giving up a bit of height and reach. However, with all that said, I am still actually not all that confident in McGee's striking at this point. Just a few years ago, he was losing stand-up affairs to guys like Sean Brady and Diego Lima. And honestly, I don't think those losses have aged all that well, even though, Brady is an up-and-coming prospect. We saw that his striking really isn't quite there yet, and he was able to fight really competitively on the feet with McGee. And since then, I can only imagine McGee getting a little slower, declining a little bit more. So while generally I do favor the technicality and the striking and experience of McGee, he could be at a stage in his career where he slowed down enough that someone like Ramiz could keep it close on the feet. So for that reason, I'm actually picking Ramiz to win this fight here. I think that on the feet, there's a chance that it'll be pretty competitive, but I do expect Ramiz to maybe mix in the grappling a little bit. I know McGee's never been submitted, but I don't think that Ramiz has to get the submission to win here. I think that if he's able to mix in the wrestling and the grappling, in 2 of the 3 rounds, get a bit of top control time, I do think he could win on the scorecards for once in his career. So I'm going to go with Ramiz here. I think he's got a few paths to victory. I think he could potentially get the submission early, and if not, I do think he can keep it close, mix in the wrestling and grappling, get a bit of control time to edge the decision here. Whereas with McGee, I feel that his only path to victory really is to keep the fight standing and win a striking-based affair, which it definitely can happen. But I do think that overall, Ramiz has got a few more paths to victory. So I'm going to go with Ramiz here. I think he should win a pretty close decision. In the next fight, we have Brian Kelleher versus Saidyokub Kakhramonov, and Kakhramonov is the minus 157 favorite. Come back on Kelleher is plus 137. So Kakhramonov looks like a pretty well-rounded fighter. I can strike, looks like he can grapple as well. Came in short notice against a surging Trevin Jones and put up a decent fight, I guess. He got the late submission, but, that was a fight where he was, I think, on his way to losing. Jones was pretty much just wall-installing him for most of the fight. Saidyokub did have a few moments in there, but by and large, I think he was I think losing the second and third round. But he did show pretty decent conditioning that fight. Was able to pull off a late submission in what was, I think, a pretty high-paced fight. Even though he did, come in short notice that fight. Overall, does look like a pretty decent prospect, but he'll be going up against a bona fide vet in Kelleher, who, is a very scrappy sort of fighter, very well-rounded, can take the fight anywhere. And, if you're deficient in any part of your game, he's going to be able to exploit it. But overall, Kelleher, he is someone who will look to kind of blitz into the pocket and just throw combinations. But he's able to mix it up pretty well. Also, showed that in his last fight against Pilardi, who, had terrible defensive grappling, and so Kelleher was able to just take him down and grind out a pretty dominant decision in that fight. So overall, I think Kelleher is a very savvy veteran. He can find ways to win fights, and he has shown that he's a pretty solid gatekeeper, pretty consistent. And, Saidyokub looking like a decent prospect, but, a little unproven still. And if Kakhramonov is not the fighter we think he is, then Kelleher will probably expose him. That said, though, I feel that Kakhramonov is a better fighter than the likes of Domingo Pilardi and Ray Rodrigues. So I do think that there's a bit of upside with Kakhramonov here. But I just don't really know if I want to lay the juice against someone like Kelleher, who has time and time again, pulled off these upsets. And at the end of the day, Kakhramonov is still a little unproven, still a little green in his career, but he will have the youth advantage by a pretty significant margin, actually, about 9 years. Kakhramonov is only 26. Kelleher is 35, and 35 at bantamweight is pretty old. And, I really don't rate wins over Pilardi and Ray Rodrigues all that highly. He does have a solid wins over the likes of Hunter Azure and O'Day Osborne. So, Kelleher could still have it, but, at 35, that cliff is getting real close. So I am going to go with Kakhramonov here, just because I haven't really seen too many weaknesses in his game. The last couple of fighters that Kelleher beat in Pilardi and Rodrigues are two guys who have very bad defensive grappling. Can't say the same about Kakhramonov. So I feel there isn't as clear of a path to victory here for Kelleher, because I do think that Kelleher, he is slowing down a bit and has been somewhat reliant on getting his wrestling and grappling going to win fights lately. Like the last times we saw Kelleher extended on the feet, the last times we saw him in extended striking exchanges were against Stamen and in Azure, and in both of those fights, he was losing a lot of the stand-up exchanges. He did end up catching Azure, in the second round, but, he was losing that fight pretty soundly up until then. And then even in the Stamen fight, he was losing most of the striking exchanges. So I suspect the speed's really starting to go for Kelleher. I just don't know if he's going to be able to hang on the feet with a lot of these younger fighters. But he's been doing a pretty good job of masking it with some of the wrestling lately. Like in his fight against Pilardi, just dominated him on the ground. The Ricky Simone fight, Simone was able to get his wrestling going, so didn't get to see too much of the striking from Kelleher. And then the Rodrigues fight ended pretty closely, so we haven't seen too many extended striking exchanges for Kelleher. But I do suspect that the speed is starting to go, and if that is the case, then I do have to favor Kakhramonov on the feet. And I just don't think Kelleher is going to be able to dominate Kakhramonov in the grappling like he did against the guys like, Pilardi and Ray Rodrigues. So I'm going to go with Kakhramonov here. Like I said before, though, I just don't know if I want to be laying too much chalk on these guys who are somewhat unproven. But I do think that Kakhramonov is UFC caliber. I think he's got a bit of potential. So, yeah, I'm going to go with Kakhramonov here. Moving along, we have what should be a pretty fun flyweight bout between Brandon Royval and Rogério Bontorin. Royval is the minus 158 favorite. Come back on Bontorin is plus 138. And we'll start with Bontorin first, who is, I think, a pretty well-rounded fighter. I do believe his base is going to be in jiu-jitsu. He's very well-versed on the ground. Very strong submission grappler, very good in transitions. The wrestling doesn't seem quite there just yet, but if the fight does hit the ground, I do think he's somewhat dangerous there. On the feet, he's got decent offensive boxing. It's nothing crazy, but it is serviceable there. Just overall, I think Bontorin is a pretty solid fighter. The big issue, I think, might just be the output, on the feet, and, his willingness to sometimes look to just stand and box with opponents. Doesn't exactly play to his strength all the time, but, I think his boxing is, serviceable enough that he can hang with a lot of guys in the division. And he'll be going up against Royval, who is a very high-paced sort of fighter. His base is in jiu-jitsu, but, he does get a little wild on the feet. A little reckless, honestly, but, if he's able to get the fight to the ground, he is someone who can push a crazy pace. As far as the grappling goes, he's very good in transition. He's very good at, just scrambling and, making his opponents just work in there, putting them in very weird positions. And he's able to do it for 3 hard rounds, but usually the fight doesn't have to go that far because most of the time he's just able to break his opponents before then. But the striking, I think, still is a bit of a work in progress with Royval. Offensively, he's not too bad, but, he does get a little wild, little reckless in there, and he does leave his chin on a platter. And, while he has shown pretty good durability, it's just you don't want to be taking too much damage. And with how wild and reckless he is, he's, prone to getting caught on the feet. But if this fight does hit the ground, I do have to favor Royval quite a bit more. Not that he's some super high level jiu-jitsu guy or anything, but because, he can just put such a crazy pace on opponents that, they just aren't able to defend the submission attempts anymore after a certain point. But taking a look at this matchup, I definitely do have to favor Royval a little more. Overall, you just can't really go wrong with a skilled fighter who can, push a crazy pace and has good cardio and durability. But, the issue with this fight is I just feel that with Royval, he's someone you kind of want to be playing as a dog. He's a little reckless in there. He's liable to make fights a little closer than they should be, which you don't really want, if you're paying juice on him. But as far as my take on the fight and how I think it plays out, I think Royval gets it done. I think Royval, if he's putting the pace on Bontorin, should be able to break Bontorin somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd round. We haven't really seen Bontorin gas out, but personally, I'm just not completely sold on his cardio just yet. I think he does a good job of pacing his fights, which is why, he's never really pushed a pace, why he doesn't really, have a particularly high output. So I think he does a good job of kind of masking that a little bit. But, in this fight, I think that if Royval is able to push the pace on Bontorin, we're going to see Bontorin start to slow down significantly, in that 2nd and 3rd round. However, I will admit this is a little speculative, and this does hinge on the fact that Royval is going to push a pace, which, according to some interviews he's done lately, he said he's going to try and take it slow, play it like a chess match, which I actually think is going to be a little detrimental to him. I think Royval is going to have more success if he just makes this a very chaotic fight. I think that if he slows it down, he'll be giving Bontorin the fight that he wants. I think that Royval should just try and push the pace and really make Bontorin work in this fight. But, as far as an official pick goes, I'm going to go with Royval. I think that if Royval pushes a high grappling-paced fight on Bontorin, I think he can get a late submission. So official pick for me is Royval. I think he gets it done round 3 submission. And in the next fight, we have Joanderson Brito versus Bill Algeo. And Brito's the minus 130 favorite. Comeback on Algeo is plus 110. And we'll start with the newcomer in Brito first. So Brito, I think, is primarily a grappler. He has shown he could strike a little bit. He's got very, explosive striking on the feet. He does get a little wild in there, looks to just kind of wing bombs to close the distance. Definitely looks like he's got a bit of power, but, I do think his basis is going to be in the grappling. And he does seem somewhat consistent in getting in the fight there. But, I have seen fights where he's primarily just looked to stand and strike with his opponents. The cardio does seem to check out as well. He's got a lot of early finishes, but, we have seen him go the distance. We have seen him win late as well. So overall, I think Brito looks like a pretty solid prospect. But again, the issue with him and with a lot of other fighters on this card is that he is still somewhat unproven. And I say somewhat because I do feel he's fought decent competition on the regional scene. We see a lot of regional guys come in, they have a lot of early finishes against very low-level guys. But I feel Brito's fought, decent competition on the regionals. It's just that he's a little unproven when it comes to the UFC level. But he'll be going up against Bill Algeo, who is one of these fighters I think is really good at, weaponizing his pace. Algeo is someone who's, very high volume in there, very high work rate. He's someone who will just move forward and throw. We've seen him go 3 hard rounds, just with nonstop output. He's super durable as well. Never been knocked out. He's been subbed a few times, but he's never been knocked out, so he's super durable. He's able to just keep coming and keep dishing out damage. And on top of that, he's actually fought some, decent names as well. Notable fighters like Ramos, Lamas, Lugnane, Jared Gordon, and even Burgos back in the day. Still lost to them all, but, the guy has fought some UFC caliber fighters. So he's definitely been tested in there a little bit more, even though he's not winning any of those fights. And another issue that I have with Algeo is he's a bit hittable. For as much of a pace or as crazy of a pace he does put out, he does take a lot of damage. It kind of evens the playing field a little bit because, opponents are able to kind of just tee off on him a bit. And on top of that, his takedown defense isn't particularly great. He's got decent get-ups, and he is pretty good at, making his opponents work to keep him down. But he also has a pretty bad habit of, giving up his back also. So, a lot of different variables going into this fight. But stylistically, I think I do have to favor Brito a little bit more. I know he's making his UFC debut, and, he's still overall a little unproven, but I don't really think that Algeo is quite UFC caliber. He might be borderline UFC caliber, but I think there's just a very clear path to victory here for Brito. If he attacks the grappling, I think that he could have a bit of success taking Algeo down, controlling him there. I think one of the best ways to deal with these high output, high pace sort of fighters is to just nullify some of their output, take him down, and just look to grind him out a bit. But, that said, I just don't know if I want to lay the chalk on Brito here. And that's kind of been the theme of this podcast. There's a lot of fighters making their UFC debuts, coming in as, juiced favorites. And depending on the bout order, you may have probably heard me say this a few times already, or you're probably about to hear me say this a number of times, but I just don't know if I'm too keen on laying the juice on these UFC debutantes who haven't quite been tested at the UFC level just yet. But I think I still have to go with Brito here. He's a 26-year-old who looks like he's 36, packs a bit of a punch, can push a decent pace, has decent cardio. Definitely a little sus, but I'll give him the benefit of the doubt here. But anyways, I'm going to go with Brito. I think he's got a path to victory here if he's consistent enough with his wrestling and grappling. So I'm going to go with Brito. I'll take him to win via decision. Moving along, we have Kleydson Rodrigues versus Zaruk Adashev, and Rodrigues is the minus 245 favorite. Comeback on Adashev is plus 210. All right, so we'll start with the UFC debutant in Rodrigues. He is primarily a striker from what I've seen. He's pretty pretty heavy-handed. Does seem to have a bit of power in his hands. Showed a lot of composure in the Contender Series fight. Was able to just pick his opponent apart over the course of 3 rounds. But, I don't know if you want to take too much from that fight. His opponent really didn't look like he had anything to offer there and was more or less just a punching bag for that fight. And that's kind of been the issue with the career of Rodrigues, in my opinion. It's just that he's looked good, but, he's fought very low level of competition, just extremely unproven. And, you can kind of say the same about Adashev. He's 4-3. He's got 3 fights in the UFC, though, but I don't think he's really that good of a fighter, if I'm being honest. He's got decent kickboxing, but, he's a little green still. Lots of movement on the feet. Is someone who is, I think, a little small for the division as well, so that'll probably play a bit of a factor here. But even in his previous fights, we see him, kind of struggle a bit closing the distance on some of his opponents. And, he might struggle with that in this fight since, Rodrigues, I think, is a pretty big flyweight. And the other concern that I do have with Adashev is, his chin does seem a little suspect. I believe he's been knocked out before, but he's also been hurt and rocked in a number of his fights as well. So a little bit of a concern there. But Adashev is someone who's got a pretty decent work rate and can push a pretty moderate pace as well. But taking a look at this matchup, it's really hard to really pick a side here. Rodrigues definitely looks like a pretty legit prospect. He's looked pretty good in most of the tape that I've seen. The only issue is really it's just against really low-level guys. And, when that's the case, it's just hard to get a read on how good he really is. So, there's no way I'm going to lay minus 250 on someone like Rodrigues who's making his UFC debut. So, while I am going to pick him, I definitely feel that this is a Adashev or pass. Adashev at least has had some UFC experience. He's beaten a UFC vet in Benoit, even though you can make the argument that Benoit's, a bit washed. Regardless, Adashev does have a little more UFC experience. And it's not like Rodrigues is some, super hype prospect or something. So I'll go with Rodrigues as an official pick, but I'm not going to hate on anyone that's taking a shot on Adashev here. And moving along, we have Michel Pereira versus Muslim Salikov. And Pereira's the minus 120 favorite. Come back on Salikov is plus 100. So we'll take a look at Salikov first. He is primarily a counter striker. He's very heavy-handed in there, very technical, a ton of experience as well. Likes to throw spinning attacks, very good defensively, very good timing on his counter-punching, and has shown decent takedown defense. The big concern with him, though, is probably going to be the age. He's getting a little older. He's 37. Doesn't really fight all that frequently either, so you just don't know if he's fallen off a cliff just yet. And on top of that, his last 2 fights were against older fighters as well, so it's kind of hard to gauge, how much he's declined by. He's for sure declining. It's just hard to see, what stage he is in his career. But overall, he is a good fighter. It's just the age is a concern here. And on top of that, he's not exactly like a cardio or, output machine. He is good at slowing down the pace, but he's overall just not going to be throwing all that much. But taking a look at his opponent, Pereira, very high action sort of fighter. He's kind of slowed it down a little bit. We've seen him take a more measured approach in his last couple of fights. I think he's gotten a little wiser now that he's gotten a few UFC fights under his belt. He's still going to throw, spinning attacks and backflips and stuff once in a while, but he's definitely toned it down from when he, first joined the UFC. But if you look past some of his more flashy strikes, he is a pretty decent striker. He does have, pretty good movement in there. He does fight decent at range. He's got a good jab, 1-2. He's got a good kicking game as well. The guy does seem to have a bit of power. And the cardio, I think, is a little bit of a concern. It's hard to get that Tristan Connolly fight out of a lot of people's minds. But, now that he's paced himself a little better, now that he's not, doing backflips and stuff off the cage, he's going to be able to go, 3 rounds, I think, pretty well, as long as, he's not blowing his load early in the fight, as long as he's not doing too much, high action sort of moves. But taking a look at this fight, I do think that it's probably going to play out somewhat close. Salikov, in his last few fights, is someone who, is really measured in there. He's good at slowing down the pace. Opponents are a little more tentative when they're up against him. They don't want to give him too many openings to counter off of. And Salikov generally just isn't someone who will throw a lot either. So I think this will probably be a somewhat low-paced, low output sort of affair. We're going to see Salikov land some hard shots. We're going to see Pereira probably land a few shots as well. But overall, I do think I favor Pereira a little bit more here. If this was Salikov maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I'd probably take him. But at this age and with how infrequently he fights, I just think that Salikov, he's on a steady decline that, it hasn't really been super apparent yet, just because he's gotten some, somewhat favorable matchups in Zaleski and Trinaldo. Both guys who are, solid vets, but 2 guys who are a little bit older. And I think that going into this fight, we could see a speed discrepancy between the two. We could maybe see a Pereira who's going to just be able to beat Salikov to the punch here. Like Salikov, he's 37 years old and Pereira is 28, so we're looking at a 9-year difference. Not to mention, Pereira being only 28, the guy's entering the prime of his career. He's pretty big welterweight as well. I mean, probably one of the bigger welterweights in the division. So I do think there's a lot of upside when it comes to Pereira. I also think that Pereira's got a few more paths to victory here. On the feet, I definitely think that Salikov's the more technical striker, just the better striker overall. But, I'm not convinced that Salikov's just going to completely blow Pereira out of the water. And I don't expect Pereira to just keep it standing 100%. He has shown that he can grapple a little bit. He has shown that he could, fight in the clinch as well. So I do think that if Pereira is able to mix it up, he's going to have a decent bit of upside here. Whereas with Salikov, you're kind of banking on this fight being a stand-up affair. And, I'm not even 100% convinced that Solikov's going to be, winning all the exchanges, or that he'll be winning very dominantly on the feet either. So I feel that even if it is a stand-up affair, it'll be a pretty close fight. But I do think that Pereira is going to be able to mix it up a little bit more and, win a pretty close decision here. And in the next fight, we have Joaquin Buckley versus Abdulrazak Alhassan, and Buckley's the minus 140 favorite. Come back on. Alhassan is plus 120. And this should be a pretty fun fight. We have two very dynamic strikers going at it. Two finishers in Buckley and Alhassan. But we'll go ahead and take a look at Buckley first. Buckley is a pretty heavy-handed striker. He's got good combination punching, likes to just explode into the pocket and just throw punches and bunches. He's good at mixing it up, does have pretty decent power, and, from what I have seen, it does look like he can maintain a pretty decent pace for at least, 2.5 rounds. He does have a decent amount of early finishes, but, he has shown that he could get knockouts late in the fight, and he has shown that he can maintain that sort of pace. So Buckley is one of these fighters that I think, has got decent power and decent cardio, which, you don't see too often. The big concern for Buckley going into this fight is that I do think that Buckley might be a little chinny. He's been knocked out twice in the UFC already. He's been knocked out on the regionals as well. And, you do have to worry about that a little bit because he is going up against Alhassan, who is one of the heaviest hitters in the division. I know he's been on a pretty rough skid lately, but I do think he's still got, some tremendous power in his hands. And, prior to the Alessio Di Chirico fight, I think a lot of people had written Alhassan off. He was coming off of a 3-fight lose streak, with his most recent loss being against Jacob Malkoun, who, a lot of people thought he was just going to go in there and starch. But, Malkoun was able to go in there, implement the wrestling, and basically just lay on top of him for 3 rounds. And historically, that's really what Alhassan's struggled with. Guys who's been able to wrestle him have had success. And, I guess the other concern with Alhassan is probably going to be the cardio. He has shown that, if he gets extended beyond that first round, he will start to slow down a bit. However, he is extremely dangerous in that first round. But, this is a pretty interesting matchup because we have two guys who, they're probably going to look to come in here and strike, both guys who are finishers. So, this is a little tricky in that because, I think either guy could get the finish here. I do favor Alhassan to get the finish early. But, as the fight starts to get into the second and third round, I would start to lean more towards the Buckley side. But overall, I think I do favor Buckley a little bit more. I mean, Alhassan was someone I think a lot of people had written off, including myself, prior to his most recent win over Di Chirico. But I really don't know if that win changes anything. He got a head kick knockout super early in the fight, so I don't know if really you could take too much away from that. And if that fight did get extended, it'd probably play out very differently. That said, though, Alhassan is definitely going to be live to get the knockout early in this fight as well. The guy's got big power. Buckley's got some potential chin issues. But, if he doesn't get that knockout, I do think that Buckley's going to start to take over later in the fight. And another thing that I think is going to be a factor in this fight is the age. Alhassan's 36 now. Hasn't looked particularly good. And Buckley, on the other hand, is 27. He's taken a bit of damage, but, I do think he's in the prime of his career, or at least entering his prime. So there could be a bit of a speed discrepancy. And, of course, I think there's going to be a cardio edge for Buckley as well. So, this could be a fight where we see Buckley just beat Alhassan to the punch. Little similar to the Chaos Williams fight, although I would have to say Williams is a much better counter striker than Buckley. But ultimately, I think I am still going to side with Buckley here. I don't think my opinion has changed too much about Alhassan, even after that head kick knockout. But I doubt I'll be betting this just because Buckley, he is primarily a striker, and I think the fighters that have had the best success against Alhassan are ones that can mix in the wrestling a little bit. And Buckley, while he has shown he could wrestle a little bit, he's not someone who is very consistent with it. And if you're going to give Alhassan a striking fight, it'll give him opportunities to find that knockout. And with how powerful Alhassan is, we could see a more tentative Buckley. And, if he's not willing to let his hands go as much, this could just be a somewhat low-paced, back and forth sort of fight. So I like Buckley here, but I'm still a little wary of the power of Alisson. But overall, I do like Buckley here. It's just, it does seem like a pretty high variance fight here. So likely a pass for me as far as the betting goes. Moving along, we have Katlyn Chookagian versus Jennifer Maia. Chookagian's the minus 173 favorite. Comeback on Maia is plus 148. And this is the rematch we've all been waiting for. Pretty straightforward breakdown, honestly. Chookagian, we kind of know the deal with her. Point fighter, likes to make noises. Whiffs on a lot of her shots, but, just the sheer work rate of her really kind of sways the judges. Combine that with some of the sound effects, and, we get her winning a lot of decisions that she probably shouldn't be winning. But overall, it is a pretty effective style. She does look like she pushes a decent pace in there. Definitely looks like she's got a high work rate. I don't think she's got a ton of power or anything, but, since she's always throwing, she's kind of gives the illusion that maybe she's landing a lot more than she is. Chookagian has shown she could grapple a little bit, but we haven't really seen it all too much. Primarily, she is just going to be a striker. And, she'll be going up against Maia, who is, I'd say, kind of similar. Maia's primarily a boxer. She could grapple, man. I think she's got solid jiu-jitsu, but she hasn't really gone to it either. She's definitely someone who's kind of fallen in love with their hands. Doesn't really, pursue takedowns, and really just looks to stand with her opponents. She does look like she's got a little more power, but, I do think overall her boxing's a little basic, honestly. I do think that if this is a striking affair, I think Chookagian takes it, but, I don't think it's going to be super lopsided. Even in the first fight, I don't think the striking exchanges were really lopsided. It's just that, Maia, she wasn't able to really match the work rate of Chookagian, and Chookagian was able to more or less just pitter-patter her way to a decision. And taking a look at this rematch, I don't really feel that Chookagian being a minus 170 roughly favorite, was really justified. I know she won that first fight, and you can make the argument that, both fighters haven't really improved. They're more or less the same fighter. So, Chookagian should take this. But, that first fight was actually pretty close. It was 29-28 across the board. Chookagian, I think, dropped the last round unanimously. Maia was able to hit a takedown late in that fight and kind of win it based off of just the, being able to control Chookagian, in that final minute and a half. And I actually feel that's a pretty big adjustment that Maia can make. Because, like I was saying before, I don't think it's very lopsided on the feet. Chookagian's probably going to look like she's throwing more and landing a little more, if it's 100% standing. But, I do think that if Maia is able to work in the clinch a little more, hit some takedowns, I think that if Maia's able to hit just one more takedown in either round 1 or round 2 of that first fight, she very easily could have won that fight. So I just think that because there's such a small adjustment that could be made by Maia, I just don't think that, Chookagian should be this big of a favorite, or at least you really shouldn't be betting her as, a juiced favorite like this. So for that reason, I think I'm actually going to be on the Maia side. I know Maia's not super reliable to go to the wrestling or the grappling at all. She's usually more than happy to just stand and strike with her opponents. But, with, a half decent game plan, she should be able to get the W here. But, I just have very little confidence in Maia to pursue the grappling. That said, though, I definitely feel that Maia's the side in terms of, betting here. Honestly, I think it'd just be a huge mistake for Maia and her team to not look to go to the grappling here. She had success with it in the first fight, and, it's very apparent that if she just decides to stand and strike with Chookagian, she's going to lose on the card. So I'm going to take a leap of faith there on Maia and her corner to come in with the correct game plan here. Look to get a little bit of top control time, maybe even just look to cage push a little bit earlier in the fight, and then look to just steal rounds that way, because on the feet, I really don't think that Chookagian's blowing Maia out of the water. So I think that if Maia is able to get, even a minute or a minute and a half of control time in either, 2 of the 3 rounds, she should be able to win the decision here. So I'm going to go with Maia in this fight. Might look to better too, because it looks like the line is continuing to widen up. Money's apparently coming in on Chookagian. So I'm going to sit on this a little bit, but I'm probably going to end up taking a unit bet on Maia here. I just think that there is a clear path to victory in the grappling. So I'm going to go with Maya. I'm going to go with her to win via decision. And in the main event, we have Calvin Kattar versus Giga Chikadze. Chikadze is the minus 230 favorite. Come back on. Kattar is plus 195. And this is a fantastic matchup between two high-level strikers. We'll start with Chikadze first, who is a kickboxer. He's got very dynamic striking. He's good at distance. He's got good footwork. He's got a good kicking game. Does a great job of mixing it up, down low to the body and to the head. He's got a nasty liver kick, the Giga kick, as he'd like to call it. And coming into this matchup, he is riding a little bit of hype. The guy's on a 3-fight finish streak after being a bit of a decisionator coming to the UFC. But since then, he's, gotten the finish over Simmons, Swanson, and Barboza. I thought the last two finishes were, very impressive. Got a win over Swanson, a bona fide vet, and then over Barboza, who, I actually bet in that fight. But, Chikadze looked very good that fight. He looked very quick. There was a lot of snap in his shots, and overall, he just looked very sharp. And I do think we're seeing a Chikadze who's really, starting to peak at this point, in his career. But overall, Chikadze is a very solid offensive striker. Really, the big knock on Chikadze has been his cardio and maybe his defensive grappling. And I do feel that there are still some unanswered questions about that. He hasn't really been tested in the grappling lately, and he hasn't really gone past 3 rounds as well. So I do feel there are still some potential cardio concerns. The grappling probably isn't going to matter too much here because Kattar is someone who is primarily a boxer. But, I do feel that Kattar can probably mix in the wrestling a little bit to really wear on the cardio of Chikadze and just to mix it up and keep him guessing. But again, Kattar really hasn't shown, much wrestling. He has done it a little bit, but, he hasn't really gone to it very consistently. But, we'll move on to Kattar. He is a very good boxer, very good hands. He's coming off of a really long layoff coming off of a year-long layoff after, just taking a beating from Holloway. And I do feel that Kattar did get a little exposed in that fight. Granted, it was against one of the best fighters in the division in Holloway. But what I mean by that is, Kattar, he's a very good boxer in there, but, he is a bit one-dimensional in that regard. And, he is a bit of a one-speed sort of fighter. Like, he doesn't really push a pace or anything. The only time he really, jumps on opponents is when he has them hurt. But outside of that, he kind of just lets his opponents lead a lot of the time. And even before the Holloway fight, Kattar was liable to do that. It's just that it didn't get exposed to that extent because Holloway, he's just an absolute cardio machine. And, if you're not going to match the pace and the pressure of Holloway, he's just going to keep touching you up. And Kattar just didn't do a great job of doing that. And I guess that's the issue I have with him. He's just sometimes maybe not aggressive enough. We did see that, previously in some of his other fights against, like Moicano and Magomed Sharipov, where they were able to kind of just chew him up at distance. And Kattar was really just not able to get much of his offense going, and it led to him just falling behind in terms of the volume and the amount of damage he's already taken. And really, that's the big concern I have with Kattar going into this fight, and just in general. He's kind of just a one-speed sort of fighter, and, if he doesn't have any answers for his opponents, in the fight, he's going to fall behind, and, he hasn't really shown he can make adjustments mid-fight either. But, that said, I do think he could actually keep it kind of competitive this fight. Kattar, despite everything I've said about him, he does have really good boxing. He is durable, and he has shown he could go 5 rounds. But overall, Kattar has shown that he will struggle a bit against kickboxers, and Chikadze is a very good kickboxer. I think that, the lead leg of Kattar is going to be there for Chikadze to chop at. And overall, I do feel that Kattar does struggle against good kickers, and Chikadze is a very good kicker. So I think stylistically, this is a tough matchup for Kattar. But on the other hand, I do think there are still some unanswered questions about Chikadze. For me, the cardio is still a bit of a question mark here. If Kattar is able to extend Chikadze, how is Chikadze going to look, in rounds 4 and 5? Furthermore, I don't think that Chikadze's really been up against a ton of adversity. He's hasn't really been in a war, in my opinion. He's kind of run through most of his opponents. I thought Barboza would be a bit more of a test for him. I thought that was going to be a fight where we see Chikadze get pushed a bit, but it didn't look like that happened. And I do feel that Kattar is probably going to be able to push Chikadze a little bit more here. And really, that's the only thing keeping me off from playing Chikadze here. It's just that, minus 200 is a little steep for someone who, hasn't really faced much adversity, who's still, I don't want to say unproven, because he did beat some really solid veterans in Swanson and Barboza most recently. But, Kattar is someone who I think is a good boxer and is in his prime. He's very tough. He's going to bring the fight to Chikadze. So I'm just a little hesitant, laying the chalk on Chikadze, seeing as how he hasn't really been extended in a lot of his fights. But stylistically, I do think that this is a fight that favors Chikadze. He's just, I think, the much more dynamic striker. And mainly, I think the kicks are going to give Kattar a lot of issues. And not to mention, Kattar is going to be coming off of a year-long layoff, while Chikadze's just been absolutely surging lately. The guy is, he's been getting a ton of hype, a ton of wins, and I do feel that's going to affect his confidence a bit. I think, going into this fight, Chikadze is going to be very confident, whereas Kattar is coming off of a life-changing beating. And if there is any ring rust at all for Kattar, that's, I think, an even bigger detriment for him, because historically, Kattar has been a pretty slow starter. If he starts slow again in this fight, I don't know if he's going to be able to catch up against someone like Chikadze, who's, I think, a very skilled, very dangerous striker. And overall, I just feel this is a very tough fight for Kattar to come back to after a year-long layoff, after taking the beating that he did. So ultimately, I'm going to go with Chikadze here. Just not super thrilled about the line, and I definitely don't want to count Kattar out here. He could be rusty after a year off, but this could also be a year where, he's really taken time to reflect, really change his game, after that beating he took. So, I don't really want to lay minus 200 something on Chikadze here, but I am going to pick him to win. I really like the momentum he's running on, and I do think this is a favorable matchup stylistically. So the pick is Chikadze, but I kind of have a feeling that Kattar might be the value side. I think that the fight might play out a bit closer than the line indicates. Probably looking at like a 48-47 sort of victory for Chikadze, I think. So, yeah, the pick here is Chikadze, and I have him winning a pretty close decision here.